Hello, and welcome back to Foss & Company's Tax Credits Today, the podcast that dives into all things tax credits. I am your host, Allison Berry, and today I'm joined by Bryen Alperin, Foss & Company's Director of Renewable Energy and Sustainable Technologies. Bryen joined Foss & Company in November of 2017 and leads all aspects of the investment, origination, and asset management process for our renewable energy and sustainability funds. Welcome, Bryen. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Allison. Excited to be here.
Great. So today we will be covering the Solar Investment Tax Credit, or ITC. Bryen, if you want to kind of give a bit of background to kick us off on this program, provide a little bit of high-level overview for us.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks, Allison. So the Solar Investment Tax Credit, or ITC, is an important federal policy mechanism that has been critical to supporting the growth of solar energy in the United States. The ITC was enacted in 2006, and since then, the solar industry has grown by more than 10,000%, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars being invested annually into the space. So it's really a great success story of a sort of public-private partnership in terms of this tax credit and the industry that it's helped promote. So in terms of the types of projects that qualify within solar, it's really any solar project from your small rooftop projects all the way up to large utility scale power plants that can qualify for these tax credits.
Great. With ESG investing such a big topic amongst investors right now, how do solar ITCs kind of fit into this conversation?
Sure. So within ESG, it means a number of different things to different investors, but many investors may have certain renewable energy goals in terms of, they're hoping to, let's say it's a corporation that is trying to achieve being 100% renewable by 2030 or some other target date. In order to do that, they can get what are called solar renewable energy certificates, or SRECs, that they can claim those certificates in order to get emissions reductions and sort of get the environmental attributes of a solar project. There's different ways to go about getting SRECs. Investors could just go out and buy them in the market or purchase them through what's called a power purchase agreement, whereby they're purchasing electricity from a project or a solar power plant. Mm-hmm. But the solar investment tax credit provides another angle for getting access to those SRECs, whereby an investor could provide a tax equity investment to a project, which is a critical piece of the capital stack for that project. And in doing so, could gain access to all or part of the SRECs that project is going to produce. So in that way, they could build in not only a financial investment for themselves, but also get access to SRECs that would help them make progress on their renewable energy goals, which may be part of their ESG strategy. There's also other ways that these tax credits can play into ESG from beyond the obvious environmental benefits. There's also social implications, job creation, the fact that many of these projects are going into rural land that may have a relatively low tax base in these counties, and we're now paying large amounts of property taxes into the future to help support the tax base in those more rural economies. And then there's, beyond sort of the job creation and those indirect benefits to the local economies, there's also the actual direct buyers of the electricity, which on some of our projects may be low or moderate income households that are able to realize substantial savings in their monthly electricity bill that create really direct benefits for those LMI constituents of these projects. So we're able to quantify a lot of those sort of social benefits on these projects as well, which can play into the ESG story.
I'll just back up a little bit here. Do you want to kind of cover what exactly ESG and an ESG investing is?
Yeah, sure. So ESG is really a framework through which companies can make investments. It stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. It's an approach essentially to evaluating the extent to which an investment would, meet those criteria. And so it's a way that corporations can look at beyond just, maximizing financial profits, but look at, the benefits to all of the stakeholders, for their organization, and also look at risks, to their organization, to their investments through that lens of, considering these risks that, may have been under-recognized historically, such as, climate risk to supply chains and things like that. So it's become very topical for investors. They're increasingly, putting money into companies that have good ESG performance. So, for the companies that are out there that are looking to improve their ESG ratings and standings in the eyes of shareholders, they're going to be judged based on, the strategies, their ESG strategy, and what they're doing to achieve that strategy. And so this concept of investing in renewable energy can play a part in that. It is difficult to exactly quantify what a investment in a solar project will translate to in terms of your ESG rating, because there's so many different ratings out there. Some of them are sort of passive ratings where these companies are looking at press releases and other public information. And so if you're very vocal about having made one of these investments, it could get picked up in that and impact your these passive ratings. And then there's also a lot of companies that will send you questionnaires, and you can actually disclose information to them in order to get a rating. And there's typically sections in those questionnaires related to renewable energy or capital invested in renewable energy, those types of things.
What type of environmental benefits do solar ITCs provide in general?
Well, what I would say in terms of the environmental benefits of making a solar ITC investment, there's this concept of additionality where, we want our investment dollars to help promote projects, enable projects that wouldn't have happened if not for us. And so if you are providing a solar tax equity investment, which is monetizing those investment tax credits, you're providing a piece of the capital stack that is critical for these renewable energy projects that also tends to be one of the most difficult pieces of the financing for them to pull together. So, in a very real way, some of the projects that we're financing through monetizing these solar ITCs would not have happened if not for, our investment in that project. And so there's an additionality story there that I think is important to understand. And so it's enabling a renewable energy project to happen, which ultimately does have these positive environmental benefits. And potentially the investor in the tax equity could also be the one to claim those emissions reductions if they are allocated some of those SRECs.
Mm-hmm. And so how would all of this kind of fit into maybe the recent conversations around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and reporting on these emissions?
Sure. So scope 1 emissions are emissions that result directly from the business activities of the corporation, such as their company facilities or company vehicles. If they are running manufacturing equipment, it's the emissions being directly emitted from that manufacturing equipment. So in terms of being able to offset those scope 1 emissions, you could invest in, say, energy efficiency improvements of your facility to or emissions reductions improvements to try to reduce the actual emissions being produced by your facility. There are, outside of the solar conversation, there are also direct sort of carbon offset credits that can be purchased or acquired. Foss is also heavily involved in carbon capture, 45Q, carbon capture sequestration tax credits, which some of those projects come with these carbon offsets that can be used to reduce your scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions describe the indirect, emissions primarily from purchased electricity. Things like, if a corporation is buying electricity to run its various offices and facilities, then the power providers, the local utilities, have a certain carbon footprint based on how they're producing that electricity. and that would contribute to the scope 2 emissions. So in order to reduce your scope 2 emissions, you could take the step of, instead of just buying your electricity from the grid, which may or may not be entirely clean, you could be buying your electricity instead from a clean energy source like a renewable energy power plant, and you could do that through buying electricity through the PPA. Now, in terms of how the tax credits could benefit in that situation, as we described, you could also make a tax credit investment in a solar project, and through that investment negotiate being allocated SRECs that could be used to claim emissions reductions without having to buy the electricity. So it would be a way to, perhaps at a lower cost, get access to that same amount of emissions reductions, or be able to get access to emissions reductions in markets where perhaps you're not in a position to enter into a renewable energy PPA and buy electricity directly. And then the third, scope 3 emissions, those are indirect emissions, from a company's suppliers or its customers. So, kind of the classic example is your sort of upstream emissions from all of your suppliers, the sourcing of raw materials, your various, supply vendors and the emissions they're producing. Corporations have been grappling with how to reduce their scope 3 emissions, given that they may not have direct control over those, the vendors and those suppliers and what those emissions are. So, are they building into their contracts with these groups, requiring them to adopt certain renewable energy or emissions reductions goals so that then the corporation itself can make progress on its scope 3 emissions? There are a number of corporations that have been sort of taking leadership roles in how to do that. It is perhaps more challenging. But one approach in terms of how a tax credit can be used is to take a tax credit investment that would also have some of these SREC or emissions reductions benefits to it, and bring one of your large vendors or suppliers that constitutes a significant portion of your scope 3 emissions, and look at sort of partnering with them together on a transaction so that they could in some way also reduce their emissions. Maybe they become the purchaser of electricity in that transaction, or they're allocated some amount of the renewable energy certificates that allow them to claim emissions reductions. So your both entities are getting some emissions reductions, and in that way the investor or corporation would be able to reduce both its scope 2 and scope 3 emissions with that type of a transaction.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know how all of that can kind of tie back in. Always leads back to tax credits, right?
We are on the tax credit podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd hope so, right? So I know you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but do you want to provide maybe a little bit more detail on like what type of financial benefits to investors and even to the public that solar ITCs or just solar tax credits provide?
Sure. So in terms of the financial benefits to, an investor, let's say a corporate investor that is investing in these to be allocated investment tax credits. So there are some benefits. Obviously, the investment tax credits, are allocated to them, and so these solar investment tax credits are a dollar for dollar reduction in your federal tax liability. So it's better than just a tax deduction. It's an actual reduction in your federal liability, and you can reduce your federal tax liability by up to 75% using these solar tax credits. I kind of think about it as that corporation is still paying in, so to speak, towards the public good. But instead of, let's say, paying taxes to the government and then having the government write a grant to a solar project, the government is saying, okay, corporation, go ahead and just, invest directly in the solar project, because we understand that, by acting as a private investor, it's going to be more efficient than if the government collected those dollars as taxes and then tried to deploy them as a grant to the project. So it's a way for corporations to reduce their tax liability, and sort of have some decision making in where they're channeling those dollars, instead of just paying into, the IRS's coffers and not having control over where those dollars go. And then, they have an opportunity to also earn a positive return on their investment. So the other benefits that are allocated to them, typically they're being allocated a large amount of the depreciation benefits associated with these projects. So, this is renewable energy equipment that can have a accelerated depreciation treatment. You could do 1 year 100% bonus depreciation, or 5-year makers depreciation are some of the popular choices to get accelerated, sort of front loaded depreciation benefits that are then largely allocated to that investor. And then on top of those, the tax credits and the depreciation, which constitute the tax benefits, there's also a cash benefit as well. The investors typically allocated some amount of annual cash flow derived from the project, as these solar projects are selling electricity every year, often on long-term fixed contracts. And so there's annual cash flows that are allocated to the investor. And then after the investment period, which is often, in a solar tax equity transaction, somewhere in the 5 to 7 year range that an investor will stay in that transaction. After that point, there's also typically a buyout whereby the investor is able to sell its interest, its remaining interest, back to the long-term owner of the project or the sponsor. And so they get some cash at that buyout. So it really comprised of the tax credits, the depreciation, and then the cash from the annual distributions and the buyout at exit.
Great. So quite a few benefits for investors.
Absolutely. And these are, this is also, I think it's important to keep in mind that these are, they're realizing these benefits from dollars that, largely would have otherwise just gone to taxes and they would have earned zero on. So I think that's really, where investors get excited is being able to earn some kind of a positive yield on these dollars that otherwise would have just gone to paying taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do good while doing well.
Absolutely.
Okay. So looking towards the future now, what types of trends or policies are you seeing that are going to have a pretty big impact on the solar industry at large?
Sure. Well, there was a number of, with the current administration, there was a number of areas where there was expectation that, there could be benefits to the renewable energy sector. So one of those was the Build Back Better Act, and a number of tax credit
Mm-hmm.
benefit, new tax credits and extensions and improvements to existing tax credits that were built into that proposed Build Back Better Act. And that aspect, I think, although the full Build Back Better Act is perhaps not moving forward, what we've heard is that the renewable energy aspects of it were never really that controversial, and so there may be a smaller version of that bill that goes forward that still has a lot of those sort of tax credits related to renewable energy, and so
Mm-hmm.
specifically, the ones I think, some of the most exciting aspects of that would be for the solar industry would be, the solar investment tax credit would be increased back up to 30%, whereas it stepped down to 26% currently of the project cost. So meaning that,
Mm-hmm.
if it costs you $100 to build a project, you could get a $30 tax credit. And there would also be a long-term extension of the solar investment tax credit, perhaps 10 years, which would be great in terms of this industry. We've often been just a few years away from a step down or a sunsetting of the tax credit, and so to have a long-term extension like that would allow the industry participants, not only developers but also suppliers and manufacturers, to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
and move forward with confidence on a longer term basis, which would only sort of add efficiency to the industry and help drive down costs in the industry and allow for the industry to grow further. There's also talk of what be called direct pay, which is an option for essentially, instead of a tax credit, the project could opt to get a cash benefit directly from the IRS as a refund on their taxes when they file. And so that is an area that we think could benefit a number of projects that maybe have a harder time getting a tax credit investor, such as smaller projects or more experimental technologies. And there also could be use cases on some large projects as well, where really it could allow for a massive growth in not only the solar industry but in a lot of the other renewable energy technologies that are emerging. And then there's some wholly new tax credits that are being contemplated in there, like renewal of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure tax credit, which not wholly new, but that would be brought back. And then new credits such as a tax credit for standalone battery storage, that could be a kind of a game changer in the industry in terms of the proliferation of battery storage technology. So there's a lot of exciting things that are built into that, that we may see some of that still come through. We're cautiously optimistic there, and then I would say though that I think the focus of the administration lately though has been on we haven't heard as much talk about it, and so it's to be seen. It seems that the near term priority in terms of upcoming elections is more about addressing rising oil prices, and I think sort of the connection of improving improving renewable energy so that we might reduce cost of electricity, and then we might get people into more electric cars, and that might long term reduce our the costs of transportation for folks and reduce our reliance on oil. That's sort of too many steps for a political argument. I think they're looking for so the political playbook is how do we just directly get at the issue of oil prices right now for the upcoming election. And so it's hard to say kind of how much this will be prioritized in the near term, but I think there's still a lot of potential that it'll be brought back in some form, and we'll see some of these improvements. But that said, I mean, even without those, I think we're very excited about the growth potential within the solar industry. I mean, this is an industry that's been growing at 33% a year for the last decade. And even if that growth rate, were to tail off somewhat, I mean, it still would likely be a, very strong growth rate within the solar industry for the next 4 or 5 years at least.
Yeah, definitely. A lot going on, and seems very promising from every angle.
Yeah, and there are some, challenges. I would say, one of the ones that's sort of top of mind right now in the industry is around tariffs. But there's also been supply chain disruption, labor shortages, other things that are making it challenging to get projects completed on budget and on time. And so from our perspective, for our investors, it does create some challenges. If they're looking, let's say that they have a sort of a one-time event with a very large tax implication, and they're looking for tax credits and they really need it to be this year. It's becoming more challenging to source projects that have a low risk of slipping from one year to the next. As you're looking at projects in the fourth quarter, almost every project has some significant risk of slipping from one year to the next, and so it's something that we have to put a lot of focus into managing that risk and communicating with investors around it. One good thing is that you can roll these credits back one year. So if it does slip, there is a path to rolling it back a year to still get that benefit. But obviously that's not an ideal situation. So we have to put a lot of focus into trying to understand the timelines and manage those.
Right. Definitely. Well, I think that covers quite a lot about solar tax credits and the industry at large. Was there anything else you kind of wanted to touch on while we were chatting?
Well, we touched a little bit on what's coming next. I mean, I would just say that solar is the last federal tax credit that's a one-year credit. And so if you're looking for, getting your credits up front in the first year, I should say the renewable energy ITC is kind of the last option there. And solar is, in my view, one of the best options within that. But there are some other emerging tax credits like the carbon capture and sequestration tax credit that are also very exciting. And so what we work with investors on is not just investing in any one tax credit, but coming up with an overall strategy around how these different tax credits can be complementary to their strategy, both from a tax and management perspective, from a profitability perspective, and then from an ESG and strategy perspective.
Great. Thanks again for joining me on the podcast today, Bryen, and for providing all these valuable insights into solar tax credits and the industry at large.
My pleasure, Allison. Thank you for having me. Always excited to talk about solar tax credits.
Yeah, until next time. And that's it for episode 2 of Foss & Company's Tax Credits Today podcast. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. For more information on Foss & Company and the programs and funds that we provide, go to www.fossandco.com.